So a very, very good evening to you all. Ecology and psyche, neighborhood and intimate selves, anthropology and psychiatry, can these be thought together? That's what we are going to talk about this evening. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Bhrigupati Singh, who's the main speaker of tonight. Bhrigupati Singh is an associate professor of anthropology and sociology at Ashoka University and visiting associate professor of psychiatry, Brown University. He works at the cusp of religion, mental health, media, and popular culture. His first book, Poverty and the Quest for Life, was a major box office hit. As you probably already know, it was awarded the Joseph Elder Prize in the Indian Social Sciences and the Award for Excellence by the American Academy of Religion. And as many of us have read the volume he co-edited with Veena Das called The Ground Between, Anthropologists Engage Philosophy. He's also part of a very interesting new book series from Fordham University Press called Thinking from Elsewhere. It's my great pleasure to welcome Bhrigu. We also have with us Dr. Shalini Singh and Dr. Alex Nading, both of whom I shall introduce when they comment on Bhrigu's paper. They are our main interlocutors for tonight. So Bhrigu, whenever you're ready, welcome.
Thank you so much, Prathama. I'll just do a screen share and then hopefully I can begin. Great. So Prathama and everyone, can you see the slide?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. So good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I want to start by thanking Prathama, Ravi, Baidik, and others at CSDS for inviting me to this Critical Humanities lecture series to present my current research on mental health and urban poverty in India. My first academic job after doing an MA in anthropology was as a research associate at Sarai CSDS, and it's a real honor to be invited back. And thanks also to Alex Nading, editor of Medical Anthropology Quarterly and a former colleague at Brown, and to Dr. Shalini for agreeing to be discussants for my talk. Dr. Shalini's department at AIMS has very kindly hosted my ethnographic research for the past 5 years or so in their community clinics in resettlement colonies in Delhi, on which this talk and the accompanying article are based. And also crucially, I want to thank the audience for joining us at this slightly unusual time of 9 p.m. since most of our audience is on Indian Standard Time. 9 p.m. is a time more often associated with watching the news or a Netflix show, but hopefully it's also a good hour for anthropology, which prides itself in trying to engage with realities that one might not hear about on the news or Netflix. As with the Netflix series, the title of this talk promised you 2 seasons. Season 1, opioid addiction, and season 2, collective violence. In the talk, since I have to limit myself to roughly 30 minutes, I'll focus only on season 1, addiction, with the hope that brief glimpses that I'll offer of season 2 might entice you to read and discuss the longer 2-part argument on addiction and on violence in the article that is available as a link with the email announcement for the talk. Hopefully, focusing on just one aspect of the argument in this talk won't be too disappointing, since opioid addiction is as critical an issue as majoritarian violence, or is it? It's becoming more common nowadays to hear people in India say that mental health is or ought to be a major issue with widely reported suicides and less widely reported but still very palpable forms of psychic distress, intensified or not, we don't yet fully know, by the pandemic. Much prior to the pandemic, though, as global mental health activists like Vikram Patel emphasized, with our population of over 1.3 billion, India has only about 4,000 psychiatrists through the entire country. Is this good or bad news from the perspective of psychic life? Or put differently, we might ask, should we in the non-West simply accept so-called Western disease categories as the only way to understand mental illness and health? For an older generation of anthropologists, the answer was an emphatic no. As you'll see in this slide, in a landmark 1985 volume, Culture and Depression, Gananath Obisekre had famously argued that rather than being pathologies, many of the signature symptoms of depression, like loss of attachment and non-responsiveness to pleasure, are in fact considered moral and spiritual goals in Buddhism. Some decades after this 1985 volume, many would argue that we now live in a different historical moment, this being the era of antidepressants and big pharma. As such, a current generation of anthropologists is beginning to ask a different set of questions. For instance, how cultures come to absorb newness, such as new concepts and technologies, including psychiatric frameworks. So more recent books like these, Depression in Japan, for instance, asks how beginning from the 1990s onwards, when the term depression was relatively unheard of in Japan, in the space of a decade or so, it came to be called the national disease of Japan, and similarly with Iran, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Some authors, like here, Ethan Waters, argues that what we're seeing today is simply the globalization of the American psyche. So in terms of psychic life, is the world finally flat, as Thomas Friedman had put it, or are there still ways to explore psychic ups and downs and global and local variations, if not only through categories of West and non-West? What are our concepts of the psyche at present in the critical humanities in conversation with and yet separate from the disease categories of psychiatry and psychoanalysis? My talk today will be focused on one such increasingly globalizing aspect of psychic life, namely addiction, in particular heroin or smack as it's called in India, and opioid painkiller addiction. How does an issue such as opioids or addiction come to be felt as urgent or not, and as part of our sense of the contemporary? Sometimes this is just a result of death tolls, although there's often, as we know, a politics of death in terms of what kinds of deaths come to count as newsworthy. Within hierarchies of newsworthiness globally, addiction has come much more strongly into international consciousness in the last few years through what is called the opioid epidemic in the United States in particular. As the very strong research in the US now describes it, opioids entered the American body politic mostly through the overprescription of painkillers. After their legal supply was cut off by health insurance, large numbers of white Americans in particular found themselves seeking out urban underworlds in search of opioid substitutes, most often black tar heroin, said to come from Mexico. But if we depart from American shores, opioid-related mortality rates can also be quite staggering. For instance, in Afghanistan or Iran or Myanmar or Spain or the UK, once we begin to pay attention to the many places in the world where heroin is the drug of the poor and the homeless. Combined with the cross-class reach of opioid painkillers, this is literally opium for the masses. As such, we might ask, is India going through an opioid epidemic like so many other countries in the world today? Before I answer this question, I should clarify that opioids are not inherently bad or pathological. They're part of a spectrum of pharmaceuticals within larger world histories of the substance-based management of well-being. As the philosopher Derrida had emphasized, the word pharmakon, from which the word pharmaceutical is derived, means both remedy and poison. As such, rather than taking a position for or against pharmaceuticals per se, we can focus on particular substances and ask what kind of an object or thing heroin or opioids are, as distinct, say, from Prozac and other mood-altering drugs, on which there has been some rigorous philosophical discussion in terms of what, for instance, the moral objection might be to pharmaceutically induced happiness and the dulling of pain. So to offer you a brief roadmap of what my presentation will be, first, I'll ask if India is going through an opioid epidemic and offer you some available figures. Next, taking a step closer to my ethnographic research, I'll outline a local research puzzle linked to a broader question of how we might study psychic life or an ecology of mind rather than assuming a sharp difference between Western and non-Western concepts of the psyche, and yet understand variation. After suggesting an answer to the research puzzle, we turn to a further question, namely what kind of a philosophical or metaphysical object is heroin or opioid painkillers? And here I'll find a gendered dimension to the answer that I'll suggest. Last, I'll end with a very brief postscript on the pandemic and the larger book project that this chapter is part of. So invoking a philosophical dimension to opioids might sound a bit obscure, but the question could also be quite direct. What, for instance, is the moral objection to the dulling of pain? One objection to opioids is its propensity for abuse, overdose, and death tolls. Contrary to a popular misconception that people in the so-called non-West are more circumspect about consuming pharmaceuticals as distinct from, say, people in the West, I should mention that in the last decade, India, for instance, has emerged as the world's highest consumer of antibiotics, as we know from the WHO's World Antibiotics Report, and outpacing China and the United States. So to ask again, is India going through an opioid epidemic? In media reports, Punjab is often depicted with sensationally high figures, which have come to be disputed within Indian addiction psychiatry, because it was found that the one study that on which these dramatic news reports were based was set in only 3 districts of Punjab, renowned as the drug epicenter of the state. Precise numbers of overdose deaths in India are harder to quantify because deaths, particularly among the poor and homeless in India, are often registered in mortuary records as cause unknown, or with entries like death by exposure to cold or heat, depending on the season. These uncertainties notwithstanding, the numerical situation is not entirely unknown. There have been only 2 national surveys of opioid use in India so far, in 2004 and a second more recent study in 2019, conducted by the AIM Psychiatry's National Drug Dependence Treatment Center, where Dr. Shalini is based. This survey here covered 200,000 randomly selected households in 186 districts across 36 states, all 36 states and union territories, interviewing 72,000 drug addicts. Some of the findings of this 2019 survey are quite startling. The prevalence of opioid use in India is 3 times the global average. About 2.1% of India's population uses opioids. More than Punjab, Uttar Pradesh has the highest number of people with opioid use problems, although in terms of percentage of population affected, the worst affected states are Mizoram and Nagaland. What kinds of diagnostics might anthropologists contribute to these global and national pictures of affliction? Our first step could be to look into the history and present of supply chains. In India, the transformation of opium or afim into heroin or smack is dated to the mid-1980s, when it first became available via Afghanistan, according to the narratives of older addicts and sellers, and then gradually began to be produced locally, mainly in Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Madhya Pradesh, the 3 states historically where poppy can be legally grown for medicinal purposes. Part of the legal poppy harvest is then siphoned off for the production of heroin, which can be synthesized, as it often is in North India, in very small one-room cottage industry type production units. As distinct from the transformation of opium into smack, synthetic opioids have a different relation to legality. In 2014, the Indian government widened the range of legally available prescription opioids by revising the NDPS, National Drug and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1985, stating that, quote, the need for pain relief is an important obligation of the government. The revised NDPS Act creates a list of essential narcotic drugs now potentially available with chemists, including codeine, oxycodone, and fentanyl, key actants in the American opioid epidemic. Beyond these histories, though, and laws and headlines, what is, we might ask, the daily life of these substances in Indian urban poor neighborhoods? So let me take you a step closer to my ethnographic work. I spent July 2015 to August 2016 as a visiting faculty member at the Department of Psychiatry at AIMS in Delhi. While at AIMS, a key location of my ethnography was the urban poor neighborhood of Trilokpuri in East Delhi, where the AIMS Psychiatry Department runs a community clinic. Trilokpuri, as many of you will know, is somewhat infamous in Delhi as a space of crime and smack addiction, remembered by many as the site of the highest death toll in the 1984 anti-Sikh riots, and having had a major Hindu-Muslim riot in 2014 and periodic outbreaks of violence since. In news reports around the 2014 incident, NDTV had coined the term riot laboratory for Trilokpuri. Administratively, Trilokpuri is a resettlement colony, a government term for settlements in which slum dwellers were forcibly or sometimes voluntarily removed from more gentrified parts of Delhi to smaller plots in what was then the outskirts of the city, most famously in urban beautification drives during the emergency, as Emma Tarlow and many others have written about. The main focus of the AIMS clinic is opioid substitution therapy, part of a set of global health initiatives funded by the WHO, in which heroin addicts are given a regular dose of a less addictive and more economically manageable substitute opioid. Strange as it may sound, to substitute one opioid for another, OST treatment can be absolutely life-saving for individuals and for households, even with the accompanying danger in India and many other parts of the world of OST medications being resold, sometimes just outside the clinic, in the open market as narcotics. In contrast, though, to outpatient OST treatments, a much more worrying phenomenon across Indian cities is the mushrooming of these kind of private Nasha Mukti Kendra, de-addiction centers, which many of us familiar with Indian cityscapes have begun to notice, particularly in recent years, advertised on walls and public spaces, often with just a cell phone number. These centers are mostly unregulated spaces of incarceration, usually at a prohibitively high monthly fee paid by the family members of a heroin addict. To return to the first of the guiding questions for this presentation, what kinds of variation might anthropologists study within these global and local epidemics? Early on in my research, I was drawn into this question as I noticed a seemingly local but quite sharp difference between Trilokpuri and another resettlement colony of Sundarnagri, where AIMS also runs an OST community clinic. An ethnographic question was posed to me with some urgency by my host, psychiatry faculty at AIMS. You must visit our other clinic, many of them said, and do a study to tell us why it's so different from Trilokpuri. Different in what way? I asked them. It's much more dangerous, they said, intriguingly. This other, more dangerous clinic in Sundarnagri is about 12 kilometers away, also the neighborhood is settled in the same year during the emergency. On first impressions, the Sundarnagri clinic did have a much edgier atmosphere. Fights would break out more often. Patients would often threaten staff and doctors with knives. The patients themselves, all male, were gaunter and had kind of hollower eyes of a kind I hadn't seen in Trilokpuri. There seemed to be fewer accompanying mothers and wives than in Trilokpuri. Rather than only a psychiatric power knowledge construction of risk, in time I found that the difference between the two neighborhoods could also be posed in more emic terms in the language of addicts themselves. As most nashebaz will tell you, there are three ways to ingest heroin. You can smoke it, which is relatively expensive, costing about 250 a piece, as it's called, or you can chase it on a foil or panni, which is slightly cheaper, about 200 rupees. After that, in a downward hierarchy that most addicts will confirm, in a different category from smokers and chasers come the injectors with their sui injections and shishi, small bottles, with heroin or other pharmaceutical cocktails, which you get from a chemist and not from a smack dealer for rupees 40 or less. That is 1/5 the price of a smoker or chaser's habit. Sorry, 1 second. So, as most addicts will put it, a chaser's life is 10 years long, an injector's life is 2 years at most. Addiction psychiatrists would agree, pointing to various vulnerabilities for injectors, including the risk of contracting HIV or hepatitis B through shared needles. So what we have are two very different modes of heroin consumption, with smokers and chasers on the one hand, and injectors on the other. Methodologically, based on repeat interviews and patient files and days and nights that I spent living in both neighborhoods, with talking to treatment seekers, addicts, male and female residents, as well as household surveys in both neighborhoods, the initially intuitive difference gradually emerged much more sharply. Trilokpuri had barely a single injector, and I say this after visiting every smack dealer, every spot in every neighborhood, every part of the neighborhood where addicts hang out. In contrast, Sundarnagri, used injections could be found everywhere, strewn in ordinary neighborhood spaces like parks. Numerically, the difference is quite stark between the two clinics. As you'll see, according to clinic figures, out of 3,138 patients in Trilokpuri, there are only 4 injecting drug users, IDUs, and 6 HIV positive patients. In contrast, in Sundarnagari, out of a total of 1,773 patients, 300 are IDUs and 137 are HIV positive. On a national scale, IDUs in India show a much higher rate of HIV than, for instance, even commercial sex workers, often assumed to be the primary drivers of the spread of HIV. As addicts put it, a chaser's life is 10 years long, an injector's life is 2 years at most. And so I arrived at a guiding question for this article or this chapter: can a neighborhood fall sick in ways different even from a proximate locality? Injection or injecting is one among other forms of self-injury. In the article, which, as I mentioned, is included as a link with the talk, I also consider a different affliction that a psychiatrist would not focus on necessarily, but an anthropologist can, where the balance sheet of injuries between the two neighborhoods undergoes a sharp reversal, namely collective violence. As I had mentioned, Trilokpuri, the healthier neighborhood from the perspective of smack addicts, is also the one called the riot laboratory. In contrast, there has never been a riot in Sundarnagari, as news reports, interviews with neighborhood residents, and household surveys confirmed. Like Trilokpuri, Sundarnagari is also very much a mixed Hindu-Muslim neighborhood, following census data and here our own household surveys in 100 households in both neighborhoods. Sorry, in the screen share, this is blocking it. So as you'll see, there are a number of different similarities, demographic similarities, including religion, place of origin, renters versus owners, the presence of government documents, general level of crime reported in both neighborhoods based on registered FIRs, which I tracked over the course of 2015. In terms of diagnostics or social diagnostics, the difference that interests me is between two different forms of self-harm. Trilokpuri doesn't inject itself, but it produces periodic riots. No such riot has ever occurred in Sundarnagari. This is not to say that Hindu-Muslim animosity or the potential for violence doesn't exist in Sundarnagari. Since 2016, I interviewed key participants in 3 incidents of explicitly Hindu-Muslim disputes, framed as such within Sundarnagari, but which stopped short of explicit violence each time, such that Sundarnagari residents can still say, ours is not a danga-grast, riot-prone locality like Trilokpuri. So how might we find our conceptual bearings for what we are comparing here? What exactly are we comparing? Within the archive of social theory, I found it quite helpful to read Emil Durkheim's book, Suicide, in relation to Trilokpuri and Sundarnagari, taking suicide not to be a question only of an endpoint of death, but of what Durkheim called suicidogenetic currents, namely forms of self-harm which may or may not result in the immediate end of life. What kinds of suicidogenetic currents pass through a neighborhood, and how do these currents vary? Suicide, as many of you might remember, is also a text in which Durkheim compared different administrative districts in Europe, sometimes adjoining districts, to ask, I quote, how a definite number of people kill themselves in a particular way repeatedly over time, and how these forms of death vary, sometimes quite sharply, between seemingly proximate and similar areas. So what then do I offer as the diagnosis for the sharp difference in the nature of suicidogenetic currents between these two neighborhoods? Focusing for now, as I mentioned, on the question of injectors versus chasers. Surprising as it may be to re-encounter one of the oldest themes of South Asian anthropology even here, part of the answer is to do with caste and the composition of these two neighborhoods. How do we understand the composition of urban neighborhoods in India? My earlier work in rural Rajasthan, which Prathama very kindly mentioned, also made me look at Indian cities quite differently. For instance, better understood like villages, primarily as caste-based clusters in poor and elite neighborhoods for the most part. In Trilokpuri, I found that the seemingly anonymous slum dwellers who were relocated, as it happens, belong primarily to the lowest castes of the Hindu and Muslim hierarchy. One way to consider a lower caste geography of a city like Delhi is to look at resettlement colonies, which are 55 in all across Delhi, each of which has an average population of around 200,000. The population of Trilokpuri is 170,000. By far, the dominant group numerically in Trilokpuri are the Balmikis, the so-called sweeper caste, lowest in the Hindu social hierarchy, whom Gandhi had famously called Harijans. Trilokpuri is divided into blocks numbered from 1 to 36. Most blocks in Trilokpuri are known as either Balmiki or as Muslim blocks. Instead of a more generalized category of Dalit or scheduled caste, if we notice the particular specific distribution of Hindu caste between these neighborhoods, then we'll see that in Sundarnagri, we find a mix of Koli, Weavers, Jatav, Chamars, and other North Indian lower castes. Occupationally, in contrast to Sundarnagri, nearly Sundarnagri, the Balmikis are by far, as we'll see here and in censuses of Trilokpuri, by far the dominant group numerically. Occupationally, as you might know, nearly every city sweeper employed by the Municipal Corporation of Delhi is a Hindu Balmiki by caste. This may sound ambivalent given the enduring hierarchies of labor, but to be a state-employed sanitation worker is a salaried profession with a middle-range monthly earning, which can be absolutely life-sustaining in the landscape of the urban poor, around 35 to 40,000 per month for a Pakka employee and about half of that for a temporary employee. Muslim families in both neighborhoods are also often linked to the waste and recycling economy, for instance, as kabadiwalas, butchers, and laborers. As anthropologists like Deepak Mehta, Ghazala Jamil, and others, and the Government of India's 2005 Sacher Committee report argued, a significant proportion of the Muslim poor may be seen as Dalit by occupation, socioeconomic status, and marriage practices. But since this social fact is denied theologically and governmentally, affirmative action programs are largely absent for Muslims and are available for Hindus in what has perhaps been one of the most far-reaching injustices of post-colonial India, in a kind of laboratory of inequality, particularly sharply visible in resettlement colonies, where they're often neighbors from 2 or 3 generations back. Over the last 50 years, you can see the changes. With this demographic composition in mind, let's return to the question of the different suicidogenetic currents in these 2 neighborhoods in relation to opioid addiction. And here is a step towards an answer. Trilokpuri is more of a neighborhood of salaried professions, although at the lowest rung of the social ladder. In contrast, Sundarnagri is almost entirely dependent on shops, thelas, and daily wages. The injectors of Sundarnagri are almost all daily wage laborers. But that isn't the entirety of the answer, even as we might be willing to acknowledge the depth of difference between salaried and daily wage labor. The economic difference is not determining, but it was significant when a more contingent set of events occurred as the chaska or craze for injections first spread in both neighborhoods, datable to about 2007 as most addicts describe it, starting from Simapuri further north, and then spreading to adjacent neighborhoods. As Philippe Bourgois describes it in his book Righteous Dope Fiend, an ethnography of IDUs in San Francisco, among injector groups, there's often an older expert skilled at finding veins and key to initiating new IDUs. In Trilokpuri in 2007, as most ex-injectors in the neighborhood describe it, a set of botched injections led to a series of sudden deaths within the neighborhood in the initial 6 months. As Suresh Balmiki, and I've changed all the names of course, Suresh Balmiki, one of the oldest patients in the Trilokpuri clinic, describes it. A friend of mine, Guddu, died in front of me with blood spurting out of his veins. After that, I decided it's much better to spend the 200 rupees for a panni rather than these dangerous injections. We even started beating up injectors, saying, "Hat gandi aadat phaila raha hai, karna hai to panni pe kar." We started making them murgas, a form of punishment. As many of you know, like the big fish, we ate up the small fish. Suresh could afford this switch back to the panni because he's an MCD Safai Karamchari in charge of 3 lanes in Block 2 of Trilokpuri. Some who are worse affected than Suresh, like his cousin Nitin, one of the few HIV positive patients in Trilokpuri, gave up smack altogether, financially supported by his mother, an MCD sweeper. But, and here's where ethnography kind of pushes us to go further, what about the Muslim smack addicts in Trilokpuri? Hypothetically, they could have formed an injector subculture and created their own kind of semi-public spaces within Trilokpuri. Rather than economic factors, here I found a kind of metaphysical difference. Metaphysical in the sense of an afterlife, the impact that deaths leave on proximate others, which affects how a suicidogenetic current might travel within a neighborhood or be resisted. For instance, among former addicts in Trilokpuri, The person I'm closest to is popularly known as Ashfaq Kebabwala, and I've changed his name as well, who runs a buffalo meat shop, a kebab shop in Block 27, the Muslim Gad or heart of Trilokpuri. Ashfaq's brother Sultani died of an injection overdose in January 2008. Nearly every member of Ashfaq's family, his father, his mother, brother, had described this death to me with details that seemed to constitute a kind of mourning. Sultani's screams the night before with tutan, the word for smack withdrawal, the 100 rupees that their father gave him, unable to bear the screams. How this happened 2 days before Eid, all that was cooked for Eid that year, the 2 days for which Sultani disappeared, how he died in a garbage dump, how Ashfaq heard about his death from the whispers of other addicts in a public bathroom, how they rushed to Guru Tegh Bahadur Hospital to claim Sultani's body, how his body was about to be cremated rather than buried when they reached the morgue, and so on. A few days later, Ashfaq gave up smack, although now, 10 years later, he still comes to collect his bi-weekly OST dose from the Trilokpuri clinic. Sundarnagari also saw a number of such deaths. As I tracked treatment dropouts, I found that there had in fact been a much higher heroin-related death toll in Sundarnagari than in Trilokpuri. The deaths in Sundarnagari were not unmarked, but living companions continued along another or different currents of compulsion. For instance, I became over time quite fond of Imtiaz, an injector in Sundarnagari, 20 years old, said to be a very talented pickpocket, adept at stealing cell phones, usually working with two friends of his, Wasim and Johar, also names changed, both of whom died during my fieldwork. Johar was known for carrying a knife, even to the clinic, and for being easily provoked. He often went to the clinic terrace to inject himself right after consuming his daily dose of methadone. Some of the other patients grimly murmured that he had begun to inject himself on his ling, penis. Ye last stage hota hai. That is, this is the last stage when there are no other veins left. It came as no surprise when we heard from Kamlesh Ji, a clinic outreach worker, that Johar's mother had called late at night to tell her that he died of an overdose. Imtiaz still praised his friend Johar. He wouldn't steal wallets, only mobiles. If it was a small mobile, he would throw it back down and tell the person that they dropped their mobile. He was a real artist. Contrary to assumptions of abandonment, Imtiaz and Johar both had quite supportive families. They had tried almost every legal occupation possible in Sundarnagari: waiter, tentwala, shop assistant, electrician. In these jobs, they could earn at most about 150 rupees per day. In contrast, 2 hours on the road and one cell phone could bring in rupees 10,000 or more. In 2015, Imtiaz's parents made a major attempt to get him out of all this. They took a loan of 80,000 rupees and bought him an e-rickshaw, but this was stolen and Imtiaz relapsed. The day after Johar's death, after shedding tears with me and others in the clinic, Imtiaz rejoined an older injector, an expert in the neighborhood called Chacha, whom he had distanced himself from after Chacha had left him bleeding and overdosed in the Tahirpur ditch opposite Sundarnagari 6 months ago. I hesitate to call this death without weeping, as Nancy Shappy Hughes had famously put it in another context. Maybe there is no way to compare Imtiaz's tears with Ashfaq's or what Ashfaq might have become had he lived in Sundarnagari rather than Trilokpuri. Instead, we might say that there are currents of life and death that we become part of depending on an ecology of mind. The contagion of injections caught and grew in the more unstable economy of Sundarnagari, leading to the sharply different comparative figures between the two clinics. These local differences can also be nationally significant, as we saw earlier with the figures for HIV in India. Within these grim circumstances, we might still pause to ask a conceptual or philosophical question. What kind of a substance is heroin? What is the current of life, the trip that addicts are chasing? A common answer, often implied within the anthropology of addiction in books like these, is that heroin is a numbing response to pain, to alienation, and to state failure. This isn't entirely untrue, but there was a strange kind of energy shared by Imtiaz and Johar and Ashfaq and other addicts in Trilokpuri and Sundarnagari that made terms like alienation or numbness or neoliberalism somehow feel inadequate. The quality of life I invoke for them is a kind of self-destructive masculine volatility that I sensed but didn't quite know how to name. And then a footnote in the history of heroin that I suddenly chanced upon brought with it a new conceptual possibility. How did heroin come to be called heroin? In 1895, Felix Hoffmann, a German chemist working at Bayer, still one of the leading pharmaceutical companies in the world, resynthesized morphine in an attempt to produce a less addictive opioid. The experiment mistakenly produced a substance twice as powerful as morphine, which for the next 12 years or so was assumed to be and marketed as non-addictive. These being the days before ethics review committees, Hoffman tried out the substance first of all on beer factory workers in Germany and asked them how it made them feel. They reported that it made them feel heroic. The word hero comes from the Greek word heroon, a shrine meant to commemorate a kind of supernatural, potentially harmful potency of the dead. In light of this biochemical or metaphysical valence, I suddenly saw my addict interlocutors more clearly. Pickpockets, some neophytes, some older, retired toughs with their jail records and colorful pet names, Bhure, Kale, Angare, part of local legends, many of them former subordinates to neighborhood big men. I was among fallen or falling heroes. If we view the heroic dimension of heroin not entirely as a delusion, but rather via Durkheim in relation to forces and currents, then ethnographic immersion tells us that smokers, chasers, and injectors present different kinds of relations to life force. Smokers often begin in what is an absolutely signature narrative among smack addicts in Delhi and the world over by trying out what was in Delhi initially called a foreign charas, or a new hi-fi expensive nasha, which came with the promise of an increase in sexual potency and extended time to ejaculation, which many claim that heroin offers among its other gratifications. A further gratification the heroin offers, as addicts often describe it, is that it makes you more dabang, or braver, a necessary quality for one of the main potential occupations for a smack addict, namely often listed as such in clinic files, occupation pickpocket. The Hindi term being not jeb katra, but jeb tarash, pocket searcher. Pickpocket gangs, known as companies, divide up the city and by bus and now metro routes. Gangs communicate with a code language known as Farsi. The head of a gang is called a machine with pusher companions called a take bars, who will create a crowd and push. Over time, those who shift to chasing might retain their swagger, but for injectors, the high is more immediate and extreme, but gradually their arms and eyes attest to their more sharply waning trajectories. Amidst these heroic disorders, we might ask, what is the place of women within this landscape of heroin? Addiction psychiatrists in India have tried to study substance abuse among women, and that on the right is an article by Dr. Shalini herself. But this is more difficult partly because of underreporting. In de-addiction centers, women patients are a rare exception, often coming for only one visit. According to available figures, like in this AIM study, the most common substance for women include gutka, non-opioid analgesics or opioid analgesics, alcohol, and benzodiazepines. Aside from consumers, though, in a quirk of the gendered division of labor, the main smack dealers across Delhi are all women, as it happens, with somewhat cinematic, mythical, heroic names like Vidva, the widow in Simapuri, Gudiya and Budiya, the doll and the old woman, a mother and daughter in Sundarnagari, and a similar pair in Trilokpuri. The Trilokpuri dealer, as it happens, is the niece of Jagga, one of the principal accused in the 1984 riots, which any of you who studied those will remember. Jagga, who was known as the butcher of Trilokpuri at the time. Unlike in Western hip-hop legend, drug dealers in India are not rich. With quite low-cost, stable, hierarchical arrangements and a large monthly payment to the police, many of the smack dealers have been in continuous operation for the last 20 years, sometimes in the exact same locations, very much within the neighborhood known to everyone. To descend further from the heroic to more ordinary struggles, in following addiction trajectories over time, I began to feel that, as with many other forms of mental illness, perhaps the most difficult labor, often strongly gendered and much harder to write about, is the labor of care. The heroes who survive often do so because of the unsaid labor of a mother or a sister or a wife. And here I point to one further stark difference in the patient files of the two clinics, with the figures for accompanying family member visits far higher in Trilokpuri. Caring for a heroin addict might also involve a quite heroic range of labors, and I describe some of these labors in the larger book project emerging from this research in the chapter following this one in the book, which is called Heroes and Heroin. A key aim of the book as a whole will be to offer new concepts of the psyche, in ways that are not entirely defined, as it often is in critical theory, either by psychoanalysis, you might think of Judith Butler, Zizek, etc., or through a cultural critique of psychiatry, which is the dominant anthropological engagement with mental health. What might new concepts of the psyche look like? The book, as it is emerging, is organized around three concepts: vitalism, skepticism, and an ecology of mind. Empirically, the book inhabits conditions beyond addiction, including schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, as well as shrine-based healing, particularly Sufi shrines, which remain a very major part of the contemporary mental health landscape in India. I'll keep schizophrenia, skepticism, and Sufi shrines for another occasion, if CSDS will invite me back. Today's presentation was on one aspect of an ecology of mind, neighborhood, and on a strange form of vitalism, not as elan vital, but as experiments with waxing and waning life, intertwined with currents of death and forms of self-harm. In terms of an ecology of mind, I offer the research optic of ecological variation, the study of sharp variations across seemingly similar areas, as a methodological tool that might be useful, I hope, across other geographies, including US or anywhere really, and disciplines like social psychiatry and public health, in disaggregating uniform ideas of an epidemic, and in undoing the assumption that a similarity of context would have corresponding outcomes on health and well-being, and in going beyond the often explicit or implicit assumption in critical theory of psychic distress as somehow being simply a function of neoliberalism, because if that were the case, we would not continue to find such sharp variation. The world, thankfully, is not flat. One last postscript and then I'll stop. What news of this ecology of addicts and addiction during the pandemic? From afar, it would seem that the severe restrictions on movement would make the already precarious forms of health and ill health, and income and expenditure and tutan or withdrawal completely unlivable. In as much as one can offer diagnosis of life and death in ethnography, this doesn't seem to have been the case in terms of, if we are to measure this in increased illness or mortality among addicts during the pandemic. Many factors went into this, at least in these two neighborhoods. In a work ethos that I've come to very deeply admire at AIMS, the OST clinics continued working without a pause through the pandemic, and the number of patients remained relatively stable. This slide is part of a tally prepared, the head nurse of this prepared it for me, in the OST clinics in Trilokpuri and Sundarnagari, documenting addiction trajectories during the pandemic and where income came from. Chemist shops, as it happened, also remained open, as a result of which the most committed injectors could still purchase the occasional set, as it's called, for Shishi Sui. For reasons harder to discern, the price of heroin only rose marginally during the pandemic. Vidwa, Gudiya, Budiya, and the other smack dealer supply somehow continued. Hotspots were, as places where addicts gather within neighborhoods, were remapped, with addicts congregating not in parks, but in abandoned bathrooms and construction sites, as they also did in pre-pandemic times. Those in particularly desperate circumstances consumed what is considered a poor man's weed or desperation weed, the wild bhang leaf, which when rubbed with your hand, produces a handmade mix of dirt and herb called hatto, which can be smoked. My research interest, though, was not only in addicts, but also in the households and neighborhoods they're part of. Our initial study, the overall study, had begun with household surveys of 100 households in Trilokpuri and Sundarnagari. Through a part of the pandemic with my research team at AIMS, we continued to do household surveys, but telephonically, in a smaller sample of 10 households, and we changed all the names to Ram in Hindu household, Rahim in Muslim household, or Rahima when it's a Muslim-headed, female-headed Muslim household, as part of a comparative larger project overseen by colleagues from Johns Hopkins University, who designed this form that during the pandemic aimed to track household income, expenditure, illness experiences, social contacts, and forms of information flow. And we added a few questions on: did anyone in the household go to sleep hungry this week, dietary adjustments, etc. While it was quite difficult and we only managed to complete 3 rounds of surveys between June and October 2020, these surveys that the AIMS team and I did still gave us a small glimpse into household income and expenditure in these households, and the timing and frequency of distress events as these emerged, but then also abated in ways that I haven't quite been able to understand and will need future research in terms of resilience or endurance, or what savings might mean in economic and in psychic terms. One of the gifts of ethnography is that it brings us closer to the mystery of how the forces of life battle against and at times successfully resist currents of death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bhrigu. I am so tempted to read a little comment that has come up on the chat box, which says, I feel really gloomy, just as I felt after reading Poverty and the Quest for Life. The thing is, it's your abiding concern, life as both concept and experience. And it's so interesting that you study poverty and how life in some senses sustains itself through that. And now you study what you call kind of idioms of self-destruction in the pursuit of life, as it were. So we'll just keep this in the background. And I shall now quickly ask our two interlocutors, Shalini and Alex, to kind of come back to back with their comments. Let me quickly introduce both of you after thanking you so much for joining us. So Shalini is assistant professor at the National Drug Dependence Treatment Center, AIIMS, New Delhi. Her essay, which Bhrigu was referring to, is called Illness Narratives of Substance Users from Urban India, The Untold Stories of Afflictions, quote unquote. You can find it in the journal Medicine Anthropology Theory 2017. Shalini will be followed by Alex Nading, who's associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Cornell University. And he works at the intersection of medical anthropology, environmental studies, and science and technology studies. His first book was very, very close to our heart, Mosquito Trails, Health and the Politics of Entanglement, 2014. And he writes widely on human microbiome, food safety, the role of toxic chemicals in global health initiatives, grassroots environmental activism, and urban ecologies, which is what Bhrigu is talking about, in Alex's case of Nicaragua. I welcome you, Shalini and Alex, and please share your thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Prathama, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Dr. Bhrigu, for the wonderful eye-opening experience, which is opioid addiction, a subject which is, of course, quite close to my heart. And I will therefore begin with the problem statement, which you briefly pointed at in the beginning of your presentation. So the national survey that was done in 2018 and published in 19 threw up results which were surprising, and they also to some extent confirmed what we already knew about the opioid epidemic in our country, in India. Roughly 2.1% of the Indian adult population between the age of 10 to 75 years is using opioid, which is exactly 3 times that of the world prevalence rate. And 28 lakh people in our country are dependent on opioids. Nearly 9 lakh people inject drugs in our country. And at the same time, if we contrast that, we have 0.29 of a psychiatrist for every 1 lakh population of our country, where the ideal number by very, very low threshold standards is 3 psychiatrists per 1 lakh population as per WHO. And therefore, it's important to move away from the rehab center model of treatment and addiction in our country, which Dr. Bhrigu described, the Nasha Mukti centers, which just come with a phone number at the end. And we need to move towards a community-based care. And that is what is being offered at these 2 community clinics, the opioid substitution therapy, which works wonderfully. You'll be happy to know that the average treatment duration of the patients and the kind of people which have been described is about 8 years. They stay in treatment and largely remain abstinent from use of opioids for roughly 8 years. Although at the same time, and this is the irony of the whole situation, about 70% of them tend to continue using cannabis, which you could see from the lists that were projected in the end. Most of them use charas, ganja, or bhang. If we come to the natural history of the opioid epidemic in our country, it will be the interesting part is that India has always been a cultural consumer of opium. We have been cultivating opium, trading it out to the rest of the world, notably China. Of course, we all know about the opium wars. We have been doing that for many years, and we have been colonized for that purpose for decades. But in the 1980s, the draconian law, the law of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances came into the picture, which actually criminalized the use and the sale of both opium-related products as well as cannabis-related products. And because it was more profitable, 40 times more profitable for people to sell heroin to the population, there was a sudden boom in the opioid use, specifically the use of heroin and the more adulterated form of that is smack, especially in the northern belt of our country. So if we look at the recent national survey, we find that the most opioid use is in the northwestern part of the country and in the northeastern part of the country, if we look at the top 10 states, which indicates that along with the siphoning off of opium from the legal cultivation for production of morphine in the country, there is also a lot of smuggling happening, a lot of leakage happening through the traditional opioid transit routes, the illegal trafficking opioid routes of the world. So, and at the same time, what we find is that there has been a recent rising popularity of pharmaceutical opioids in India, as was pointed out. And especially amongst the injecting drug users, the pharmaceutical opioids such as Fortwin, I'm sure some of you must have heard of it, or the use of buprenorphine also as lupigesic or morphine has become more and more popular. So the shishis and the sets have begin to gain popularity once again because of their easier availability. And as was pointed out, it was during the lockdown that we saw that many patients were able to go back to their, the trustworthy chemist shops and be able to purchase pharmaceutical opioids with a lot of ease, therefore being able to maintain their opioid use habit. At the same time, in India, opioid use for management of pain, especially management of cancer pain, is still lacking in its intensity and in its reach to the people who need it the most, turning it into a massive human rights abuse issue. And at the same time, so there's a lot sort of opioidophobia that exists. Coming back to the particular communities that were referred to and the occupations that were referred to, that actually points us towards a kind of understanding that we need towards the people who use heroin in these communities. As Dr. Bhrigupati pointed out, it is actually, you look at the way they source their heroin, their smack, with a feeling of respect. They're able to, they really sort of overcome a lot of adversities, and they're able to sort of, purchase smack worth rupees 1,000 per day, even 2,000 per day, just to sustain their habit. Even during the lockdown, they were able to manage something like that. And it just shows, and it's actually something that we use to motivate the patients, that you have been so resourceful, you have been so intelligent and so passionate about sourcing money to fund your smack use habit during your phase of addiction. Then you can use that same instinct, that same killer instinct, the same heroic instinct, as Dr. Bhrigupati called it, to be able to stay away from the use too. And of course, there is a great female burden, especially as a caregiver for these patients. And it is felt, I think, equally in Trilokpuri and Sundarnagari, but it is visible more in Trilokpuri because, as was pointed out, the number of people accompanying the patient are higher in Trilokpuri due to the better family cohesion in that area. And finally, my final point is about the current drug control strategy. The best way to sort of throw some light on it is to see that the national sort of amount of heroin seized by the Narcotic Control Bureau in our country is about 1,800 kgs per year. So even if we assume that it is adulterated 10 times and sold as smack, so we assume that 18,000 kg of smack if it is being sort of seized every year. But if we look at the problem statement and we look at the number of people dependent on heroin in our country, and if we assume that each of them use only 0.5 grams of heroin in this country, the amount of heroin that should have been seized is roughly amounting up to 360,000 kg per year, which just shows that simply by trying to control the supply or simply by trying to use brute force to manage the opioid epidemic in this country is not going to work. There has to be a better understanding of the ecologies in which opioid epidemics begin, the kind of problems faced by people who are dependent on opioids, and to kind of try to have a more holistic understanding of how it starts, how it progresses, how it worsens. Why do they have such short life cycles? What else contributes to that, which will help us sort of reduce the demand for opioids and therefore overcome this problem in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalini. Alex?
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks to everyone for the invitation, and I really, such a pleasure to be able to engage again with Bhrigu after being colleagues for a few years. I've always valued being able to engage with his work, and I think my comments here, will be slightly different than Dr. Shalini's, partly because I am neither a specialist on addiction nor on India per se. So I come at this as a generalist medical anthropologist with a special interest in cities. But Bhrigu asked me to start by saying something about medical anthropology, and I think there's lots of different ways to define our field, but I think it's actually brilliantly modeled in the talk you just heard. And so we tend to distinguish ourselves by looking sort of orthogonally at the technical questions that tend to preoccupy epidemiology and clinical medicine. So clinical practitioners tend to be interested in the best way to treat something like opioid addiction, while epidemiologists want to learn about the distribution of addiction across populations. And these are important questions, but I think these are questions that tend to mostly be about being sick or being well. And I think medical anthropologists are different in that we're interested in the question of what it means to become ill and to become healed. And so the title of the talk and the paper, Can a Neighborhood Fall Sick, I think is a clue, right? The question isn't whether a neighborhood is healthy or unhealthy, a 1 or a 0 in kind of a binary code, but the trajectory of that neighborhood and its occupants along what Bhrigu calls this waxing and waning threshold of life, right? And so I think this paper is really a great example of what medical anthropology can do. But if you notice, it's also a critique of sorts of a certain kind of medical anthropology that maybe in a quest to seem relevant to public health or public policy tends to situate its findings closer to that issue of being than that issue of becoming. So a lot of anthropologists today are called upon to account for causal factors in the onset or the persistence of disease. And we're social scientists, and we're often drawn to discussions of what are called the social determinants of health and illness. But as Bhrigu points to, such social determinants can include things like caste, class, religious difference, and of course, position within a national or global political economy. So social determinants are always multiple and somewhat murky. So to try to sort of narrow this down, an earlier generation of anthropologists made its mark on medicine by promoting what is sometimes called cultural competency, right? This skill to discern how something like religious belief might shape a patient's understanding of their condition. And then more recently, some anthropologists have turned attention to what they call structural competency, which is the skill to discern how poverty, inequality, or identity impinge upon the life chances of patients. And it's this structure that might make similar conditions like opioid addiction or COVID-19 fundamentally different depending on the positionality of the subject. But what I think is so enlightening and interesting about this talk is that Bhrigu's charting a different course, right? Instead of studying social or cultural determinants, he's offering us this analytic of suicidogenetic currents. And I see this concept of currents, this sort of pulse of ecological variations that ramify through a neighborhood, as a way of recentering our thinking on becoming rather than being, right? So what currents seem to accomplish for me is that frameworks like that's something like structural competency doesn't, is this blurring of the division between an individual subject and the social or material milieu in which they become ill, this ecology of mind. So to quote the version of the paper that I read, Bhrigupati writes that addiction trajectories are better understood not as isolated pathologies, but as one among other forms of life and death within specific ecologies. I think that's a good summary of the takeaway here. So if what I said to start my comments is true, then that statement seems to capture a bedrock principle of medical anthropology. But as I read and listened to this paper, I was struck by how novel it sounded coming from this material. So in some ways, the idea that Bhrigupati presents seems to echo ones that are currently emanating not so much from medical anthropology, but actually from social epidemiology. I was thinking particularly of the eco-social approach of scholars like Nancy Krieger. And she talks about how in mainstream epidemiology, these sort of distal or upstream influences on health, like economic inequality or discrimination, become sort of artificially separated from proximate or downstream influences, like direct exposure to pathogens such as viruses or addictive substances such as heroin. And so Krieger sort of pushes back against this proximal distal divide with an accounting of what she calls levels of exposure, right? Things that don't really correspond to spatial or institutional constructs of scale, right? And so depending on context, actors' relationships to both proximate and distal causes might be different. And so I think there's a kind of a kinship there between that view of the eco-social and the view that that Bhrigupati is promoting, right? So I'm interested if eco-social theory, particularly the notion of how those different forces impinge upon the power to become in different ways, has entered your conversations with your colleagues at Ames. And I'm also interested in knowing more about the way in which this larger project is going to help us rethink the notion of the neighborhood. And I think there's really tremendous value in attending to this meso scale of analysis. And this is where I see a lot of sort of affinity with my own work in peri-urban Managua, Nicaragua. And there I study a lot of people whose sense of health and identity is tied to neighborhood rather than city, and often over and above nation, right? And so the city where I work is divided into about 13 different administrative zones, and they each have their own history of settlement. And so while religion or caste difference isn't obviously a salient there, violence and disease and addiction certainly are. And what's always struck me is the way in which certain neighborhoods associated with violence or disease seem to take on a kind of affective charge when you enter them, right? Even when you're accompanied by residents of those very neighborhoods, right? So there seems to be, as Bhrigupati would say, a current coursing through those neighborhoods. And this current is really difficult to account for with conventional sociology, since neighborhoods are in some sense administrative or historical conveniences. So how does something that's an administrative convenience then take on this charge, right? And so in thinking about that, I began wondering what Bhrigupati might make of thinking with the concept of affective atmospheres that's been developed by urban scholars elsewhere. I'm thinking in particular of a paper I was quite taken with by the geographer Matthew Gandy. And he in that paper, he takes anthropologists, at least some anthropologists, to task for conceiving of affect in a Deleuzian Spinozist framework that resists the stratigraphic kind of view that comes from Marxist urban theory, right? And those are the kinds of structural frameworks that I think Bhrigupati is also critiquing, right? Which depend on these loose notions of neoliberalism to explain different phenomena. So Gandy suggests that affective atmospheres, which might be another word for currents, have to be understood in ways that account for historical and material conditions. And to do this, he draws on, among others, the work of the feminist philosopher Teresa Brennan, and suggests that forms of becoming, right, including the tendency to seek a high in injecting instead of smoking smack, or the tendency to join in communal violence, these forms of becoming percolate through society, not just because of a background hum of immaterial or ineffable feelings, right, the kind favored by some affect theorists, but because of a material biophysical transmission of signals, including chemical signals. So the materiality of heroin is very important, right? And so transmission is shaped but not overdetermined by the political economy of the heroin economy itself. And this suggests that the sense that one neighborhood is more violent or more addicted than another may not just be an impression, a perception, but it may quite literally be in the air, in the soil, or in the blood, right? So the circulation of smack and different kinds of meat and contaminated water through these neighborhoods with all the pleasure and pain and taste and smell and emotion that that conveys is shaped by political economy, but that circulation manifests in bodies and psyches in different ways. And so once we understand that material and psychological forms of becoming bleed into one another, it becomes difficult to think of the individual body or the individual pathology as the proper unit of analysis, right? We have to find a way to build atmosphere into our work as not as context, right? The social that impinges on the biological, but as the subject of study itself. And that's what I think is accomplished here. So I wanted a little bit more about how the current with these electrical or hydrological connotation gets us to a place that maybe an atmosphere with its airier, dustier, windier, but also smellier and more visual connotations doesn't. So I'll stop there. I really appreciated the chance to engage with this. So thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alex. That was really insightful.